The day my father died, I stood in his office expecting closure. What I got was betrayal inked in a legal document. He'd left everything. Our home, his company, even my mother's wedding ring, to the woman he married just 2 years ago. My stepmother looked at me with a smile that said, "You were never part of the plan." That was the day I buried my father and started digging up the truth. The lawyer's voice was calm, practiced. Harold Klein, a man who'd spent decades sharpening his words into clean, quiet blades. "Your father's estate has been fully transferred in accordance with the updated trust," he said, laying out the documents like a dealer in a rigged game. His shares in Merrick Holdings, the property assets, the secondary accounts, all now under the sole control of Mrs. Eleanor Merrick. Mrs. Eleanor Merrick. I nearly laughed. She sat across the desk from me, legs crossed, perfect posture, skin untouched by time or guilt. 37, poised, polished, and not even pretending to mourn. Her black dress was expensive but barely funereal, her makeup flawless. I could smell her perfume across the room, something soft and powdered and manipulative. She didn't even blink when I reached for the trust agreement with a steady hand. It was all there. Everything my father had promised me since I was 17. Gone. Signed over 3 months ago, while he was still alive. While I was running his company, making him money, protecting the legacy he'd spent 40 years building. And he'd handed it all to a woman who called me sweetheart in the kitchen and smiled like I was something left behind from his first life. My real family. My mother, who died when I was 20, and my father, who used to take me to shareholder meetings like I was his lieutenant, erased in 2 years and a few signatures. I looked at Eleanor. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The way she watched me, calm, waiting, like this was all inevitable, told me everything. She'd planned this, and she'd won. I rose from the chair. "I'll need copies of these." Harold hesitated. "Of course. We'll have everything scanned and sent to your personal counsel." "I won't be needing counsel," I said, taking one last look around the office that used to belong to my father. "This is done." I walked out without another word. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The drive back to my apartment was a blur, not because of the traffic, but because I couldn't stop seeing his signature. My father's actual signature, authorizing the transfer of everything we'd built together to a woman who hadn't even known him when he was still sharp. I could feel the rage blooming under my skin, but it was cold, focused, the kind that doesn't fade in a few days or weeks. I didn't call Eleanor. I didn't speak to the board. I didn't answer the dozens of texts from family friends pretending to be shocked. Instead, I opened my safe. Inside were backup drives, files, passwords, copies of things I wasn't supposed to have, but always kept, contracts, merger proposals, records of every board vote I'd ever witnessed. I hadn't needed them. Until now. Because this wasn't just about money. It wasn't about control. It was about how a woman like Eleanor, who showed up 2 years ago with nothing but a designer handbag and a charming smile, managed to convince one of the most ruthless businessmen I've ever known to rewrite his entire legacy. I had questions, and I wasn't going to ask them. I was going to answer them myself. And then I was going to take back everything. I started with the house. Not the one I lived in, the one she'd taken from me. The estate in Lexington where I'd spent every Sunday morning of my childhood, helping my father prune the garden he refused to hire anyone for. Where he made me rake the leaves, shovel the walk, change my mother's brake pads. A man doesn't pay someone to do what he should know himself, he'd always said. Now the man who taught me that had left it all to someone who didn't even know how to use the front gate code until 3 months ago. The house felt different. Less like a home, more like a showroom. Cold. The warmth was gone. Family photos, the ones with my mother, with me in braces, with him in his awful cable-knit sweaters, were missing. I found them in boxes in the garage, stacked like garbage. Replaced on the walls by sterile art. Landscapes. Abstracts. Clean lines. No history. She hadn't just moved in. She'd wiped the place. I told the groundskeeper I needed to retrieve a few belongings. He didn't question it. No one did. I was still Daniel Merrick, at least on the surface. The one who built Merrick Holdings into something my father hadn't even imagined. Who pulled it out of the recession, who renegotiated contracts with 3 international suppliers while Eleanor was still writing checks for charity galas. In the study, I found the old cabinet with the family financials. Still locked. Still the same code. My mother's birthday. Eleanor hadn't thought to change it. Maybe she didn't even know it existed. Inside were ledgers, journals, and beneath them, trust documents. Original versions, marked up with notes in my father's handwriting. And then something strange, a thin manila folder labeled in unfamiliar handwriting. Estate adjustments, private. It wasn't my father's writing. It wasn't Eleanor's either. Inside, a draft of the first version of the trust update, one that still split the estate 50-50 between Eleanor and me. Notes from someone named Mark Atwell, a financial advisor I'd never heard of. A printed email chain. Partial. The top message caught my eye immediately. From Daniel Merrick. To Harold Klein, Mark Atwell. Subject: urgent revisions, per our last discussion. Date: 3 days before the final trust execution. I appreciate your discretion on this. Daniel has always been emotionally reactive. This structure ensures he has no claim to challenge. As we agreed, language must be airtight. And for the record, he'll never see these documents. I'll make sure of it. I read that last line again. He'll never see these documents. I'll make sure of it. I sat down in my father's leather chair and stared at the email chain until the room stopped spinning. She didn't just manipulate him. She engineered it. With legal help. With strategy. With a level of precision that said this wasn't impulsive. This was designed. A surgical removal. Of me. I took photos of everything. Every page. Every email. Every signature. I copied the estate ledger files onto a flash drive I kept on my keychain. Old habit. When I left the house, I didn't say goodbye to the staff. I didn't close the study door gently. I let it swing shut with a snap. Back at my place, I spread it all out. Emails, legal notes, versions of the trust, cross-referencing handwriting, timestamps, email headers. I knew what I was looking at. Eleanor hadn't just influenced my father. She'd bypassed me legally by modifying the trust in a way that would eliminate contestation. A rarely used clause about dependent beneficiaries that only applied to children under 30 in most trusts. I was 32, but there was a line in the addendum that reclassified me as independent adult with substantial means. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Substantial means. Was that what my father thought of me in the end? That I didn't need anything? That I had enough? Or had he even read that version before he signed it? That's when the pieces started falling into place. Mark Atwell, the unknown financial advisor. The one whose name appeared on every draft of the updated documents, but who had never been part of my father's original team. I searched him. Nothing at first. No LinkedIn. No company page. Just a few mentions buried in obscure corporate filings. Then I found it. He was listed as the founder of a small private firm out of Connecticut. Registered to a P.O. box. The firm's only public filing? A consulting agreement with a company called Eleanor Strategies, LLC. I froze. Eleanor. She hadn't just married my father. She'd set up an entire shell structure to facilitate her takeover. With advisors, attorneys, strategy. I looked again at the filing date for Eleanor Strategies, LLC. For months before she even married him. That was when I stopped feeling angry and started feeling surgical. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled every file I'd ever archived from my time at Merrick Holdings. I combed through HR records, email chains, archived memos, performance reviews. I made a list of board members she'd started courting the minute she was Mrs. Merrick. The ones who started deferring to her ideas. The ones who suddenly started pushing back on mine. She'd been building alliances. While I was running quarterly reviews and managing supplier mergers, she was hosting private dinners. Writing checks to board members' alma maters, inviting their wives to charity events. This hadn't started with my father's death. It had started the moment she met him, and no one had stopped her. I sat at my kitchen counter, surrounded by pages and files, and realized the truth. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a hostile takeover, and I'd just become the only shareholder who knew it. But not for long. I didn't announce anything. No legal challenge. No press interview. Not even a quiet rumor seated among the board. That's not how you prepare for war. That's how you ask to lose it. Instead, I disappeared exactly the way Eleanor hoped I would, quietly, without ceremony. I pulled back from the company. I stopped attending meetings. I returned calls late or not at all. I let her have her stage, let her enjoy the illusion of total control. Because control is always an illusion. And I was done warning people. While she was polishing her speeches and flattering board members' wives, I was in the one place that still belonged to me, the server. My father, for all his ego and final betrayals, still hadn't updated the internal network credentials I'd created years ago. Probably didn't even know how. It was a backdoor, the kind every old system keeps if you know where to look. Buried under years of architecture and masked by outdated access logs, it was something only a person who had built the structure from scratch could ever find again. Eleanor didn't know it existed. Neither did Harold Klein or any of her new advisors. They were too busy looking forward to check what was behind them. I spent nights combing through every document the legal team ever touched, and after 3 days of sifting through drafts, clauses, and scanned copies of old agreements, I found the mistake they thought they'd buried. It was an early draft of the trust, not the final version that Eleanor had waved in my face, but one from weeks earlier. This draft still had me listed as a 50% beneficiary, still included language about joint oversight of the Merrick Foundation, still named me as successor trustee. And the annotations, that's where the truth lived. The notes in the margins weren't from my father. They were written in a neater, smaller hand. Different ink. Labeled initials I didn't recognize at first, M.A. I knew the name when it finally came to me. Mark Atwell, a consultant I'd never met, never spoken to, and who had never been introduced through any formal channel in the company. His name appeared nowhere in official records until after Eleanor arrived. Yet here he was, marking up one of the most important legal documents in our family's history like he was editing a memo. And the things he changed, they weren't just suggestions. They were surgical. One line in particular stood out, rewritten in full. Beneficiary designations updated to reflect revised dependency classification per new asset holdings. That sentence erased me from the trust. Not my father's pen, not my father's idea, but someone had told him it was necessary. The rage I felt reading that was quiet, still. It didn't burn. It settled in like a weight you stop trying to lift because you know you'll be carrying it for a long time. I wasn't looking for evidence anymore. I was building a case. I wasn't planning revenge. I was calculating it. And when you're calculating, you keep going. Buried deeper in the server logs, in a forgotten backup folder from the legal archive, I found a file that shouldn't have existed. An audio memo. It was mislabeled, like someone had renamed it quickly and never circled back. I listened to it once, then again, and again. It was a meeting recorded without their knowledge. Eleanor, Harold Klein, and the same Mark Atwell. I recognized their voices, clipped and deliberate. The tone was confident. They spoke like people who had already won. Daniel is emotional, Eleanor was saying, calm and certain. But if we structure this the right way, we can bury him in paperwork before he even understands what he's reading. Harold's voice followed. The current draft should hold. I've layered the clauses enough that if he tries to contest, he'll be fighting uphill with no traction. Then Atwell, there's a small risk. The foundation structure leaves an opening. I don't want openings, Eleanor said. Close it. Make sure he has nothing to stand on. If he finds out what we're doing, I don't want him able to touch a single piece of it. That was the end of the recording. No names. No formal admissions. But it was enough. Not for court. Not yet. But enough for leverage. Enough for silence. Enough for her to start wondering how much I knew without ever telling her. I backed up the file 6 different ways. Stored it in encrypted drives. Sent it to a legal repository under a name no one in the Merrick family had ever heard. And then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. A week later, I found the final thread. I wasn't even looking for it when it surfaced. It came from an archived company drive linked to the Merrick Foundation's operations team. A series of internal memos between the International Accounts Office and a name I'd never seen before, Crest Management, Geneva. They were handling new fund transfers, liquidation notices, quiet movement of assets into offshore accounts registered to shell companies with no oversight. And the approval? It was signed digitally by Eleanor. Not weeks after my father's death. Weeks before it. I wasn't angry. I was impressed. It had taken her 2 years to dismantle my father's empire from the inside out. She hadn't just won his heart. She'd bought the lawyer, hired the consultant, created a narrative, made herself the grieving wife who happened to inherit control of one of the largest family-owned holding companies in the Northeast. But she hadn't counted on one thing. I hadn't left. I hadn't broken. And now I had everything. I needed one more piece. One pair of hands still inside the company. One person with access to the live system logs that would prove everything. So I called Rachel. Not because I trusted her. That wasn't something I did anymore, but because she owed me. She answered quickly, her voice tight. You know I can't talk right now. I'm not asking you to talk. I'm asking you to listen. Daniel. She's laundering foundation money through offshore shells in Geneva. I have the approvals. I have her signature. But I need the logs that show the board never voted on it. There was a long silence. Then a shift in her voice. You're serious. I'm finished playing. More silence. Then, give me 2 days. No more. 2 days later, a flash drive arrived at my door. No return address. No note. Just one clean device with everything I asked for. Board vote logs. Meeting minutes. Approval trails. The absence of signatures where there should have been oversight. I plugged it in, sat back, and stared at the screen for a long time. It was done. I wasn't going to threaten her. I wasn't going to blackmail or demand a meeting in some dramatic hotel room with legal pads and non-disclosure forms. That's not how this ends. She wanted an audience. She wanted a show. She was going to get one, but not the kind she could control. She'd scheduled her first major shareholder address, a sleek, overproduced spectacle at the corporate auditorium where she'd planned to lay out her vision for the new Merrick. The press would be there. So would the board, investors, former allies, everyone whose approval she needed to solidify her image as the legitimate heir. And I had a front row seat. No press release, no warning, no emotion, just a name on the guest list she didn't expect. Just me, sitting silently, holding everything she thought I'd never find. The invitation came a week before the event, emailed to investors, board members, executive staff, and, I assumed, anyone with a net worth Eleanor deemed high enough to matter. It was branded, carefully designed, bearing the new Merrick Holdings logo she'd commissioned after her transition into stewardship, as she so delicately put it in every interview. The event was billed as the future of Merrick, a legacy reimagined. And the location? The Grand Hall at our downtown headquarters, the same one where I had once presented quarterly earnings with my father seated beside me, nodding at every number like it was a sermon and I was the chosen son. I didn't RSVP. I didn't need to. At 10:06 a.m., I walked in through the side entrance, past the security guards in tailored suits, past the black-clad catering staff with trays of champagne and smug direction. No one stopped me. No one dared. I wore a charcoal suit, nothing flashy, no tie. Just enough to signal power without pretending I wanted attention. People saw me. Of course they did. A few offered shallow nods. Others looked away, confused, uncomfortable. Eleanor had done her work. Painted me as the prodigal, the bitter son, the private man licking his wounds somewhere on an island of irrelevance. But I was standing here, not faded, not ruined, calm, present. I took my seat in the front row, third from center, directly in her eyeline. It took her exactly 3 seconds to see me. She'd stepped onto the stage with the kind of practiced confidence only someone who believes they've already won can carry. Her posture perfect, her smile warm and mechanical, eyes scanning the crowd like a performer, soaking in applause before the music begins. And then she saw me, and for the briefest moment, something shifted. Her foot hesitated mid-step. Her smile paused. It was small, but not to me. I watched her recover. She was good. I'll give her that. She stepped behind the podium, thanked the attendees, offered a soft note about my father's legacy, her voice faltering just enough to appear human. She talked about innovation, global expansion, ethical investments. She threw out words like sustainability, digital transformation, multi-market alignment, buzzwords crafted by consultants to sound like strategy. The room ate it up. But then she moved to the Merrick Foundation. She described the foundation as her deepest personal mission, said that in honor of my father's memory, she'd expanded the foundation's reach, opened international arms, streamlined its operations for maximum philanthropic efficiency. She smiled again, that warm, confident, utterly fabricated smile, and added that they'd recently begun a full audit to realign with the company's new goals. And that's when I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood, calmly, slowly, eyes forward, hands clasped behind my back. And the room changed. People turned. Conversations halted. You could feel the shift, not panic, not yet, but something more dangerous. Doubt. Eleanor paused. She looked at me, this time directly, and I saw it. Behind her eyes, the calculation. How much did I know? What had I found? Was this theater or a warning shot? Eleanor, I said, my voice clear, steady, amplified not by a mic, but by the silence that had spread like smoke through the room. Would you like to explain how 42 million in restricted foundation capital was redirected without board oversight? Gasps are not subtle things, especially not in a room of shareholders. Eleanor blinked. Daniel, this isn't the forum. I agree, I said, stepping closer to the aisle. This isn't the forum for laundering funds through shell entities in Switzerland either. But here we are. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but nothing came out. I turned to the crowd. I have documents, transfer logs, board records, or more accurately, the absence of board approval. I have internal emails detailing the timeline of those transfers. I also have a recording, an off-the-record meeting in which Mrs. Merrick and legal counsel discussed how to exclude me from the family trust using legally questionable structures. That recording, by the way, was made 3 weeks before my father's death. No one moved. And then a voice from the back, someone from the compliance division, I think, spoke up. Daniel, is this a formal allegation? I turned to look at them. Not yet, but it's a formal warning. Eleanor finally found her voice. This is a deeply inappropriate ambush. If you had concerns, you should have brought them to legal, not hijacked a shareholder event. If I had brought them to legal, I said, stepping forward, I would have been sitting across from Harold Klein again. And Harold is currently under review by the Bar Association for breach of fiduciary duty, a complaint I filed last week, by the way. Her mask cracked. Not shattered, but cracked. She glanced to the side, looking for someone, anyone, who could pull her out of this moment. But the board members weren't moving. The executives weren't rushing in. Everyone was waiting to see if the house would burn. I kept going. I am not here to reclaim my seat. I'm not here to undo what's been done. But I am here to say this. I know what you did. I know how you did it. And so does the Merrick board now. So do the shareholders. And tomorrow morning, so will the press. Is this blackmail? She asked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were wild now. Are you threatening me in front of the entire executive body? No, I said, looking her dead in the eye. I'm reminding you what happens when you try to bury someone who knows where every document is filed. You didn't inherit a company, Eleanor. You hijacked a legacy. And the only reason I didn't stop you sooner was because I wanted you to believe you'd already won. The silence after that wasn't shocked. It was loaded. People in that room weren't stunned by what I said. They were stunned by how long it had taken someone to say it. I turned, not waiting for applause, not looking back. I walked out of that hall with one thing in my pocket. Not power, not vengeance. Leverage. And just enough silence behind me to know it had landed. She had always underestimated one thing. Not my anger. My patience. I didn't go home after the shareholder event. I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour a drink or text Rachel or call anyone to ask how it had gone over. I already knew. There are moments when silence is louder than applause, and when I walked out of that auditorium, no one said a word. That kind of stillness doesn't follow weakness. It follows impact. That night, I sat in the old apartment above my father's garage. It was where I lived during college summers, where I used to bring home stacks of financial statements to study like scripture. The walls still had the faint smell of lacquered wood and heat-dried books. I kept the lights low and stared at the floor like it could offer answers. I thought I would feel satisfied, vindicated, something. But there was no victory in what I'd done. No celebration in reminding a room full of vultures who built the house they were feeding on. No comfort in watching Eleanor's face fracture beneath all her planning. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was the weight of what I'd lost trying to protect something that was never mine to begin with. She'd called me that night. For times. I let every call ring out. Then she texted, "You think you've won. You haven't." I didn't respond. What she didn't understand, and maybe never would, was that I didn't want to win. Not anymore. What I wanted was to make sure she never felt safe holding something she stole. I wanted her to look over her shoulder in every board meeting, wonder if this was the moment someone would ask her about the Geneva accounts, or the unapproved transfers, or the missing trust documents. I wanted her to sit in the office my father once ruled and feel its weight turning into ice. And she did. 3 days after the event, the board called an emergency session. Not because of me. I stayed quiet after that morning, but because one of the compliance officers finally decided to investigate the audit reports. Once they found the inconsistencies in the foundation structure, Everything else followed. Not all at once, but fast enough that Eleanor didn't see it coming. They didn't fire her. Of course not. These things don't happen that way. There's no public shaming, no dramatic removal. Just quiet votes, contract reviews, performance concerns. They announced a leadership restructure 2 weeks later. She was given a consulting title, one with no real power. A seat on a subcommittee. They made it sound respectful, but I knew what it was. It was exile wrapped in silk. She didn't leave the company, but she left the room, and I never stepped foot in that building again. The foundation was returned to full board oversight. The Geneva transfers were halted. A forensic audit was launched. Eleanor's consultants vanished. The trust was quietly reopened under judicial review due to inconsistencies in the last-minute revisions. No one said the word fraud, but the air around her began to change. Banks became colder. Doors stopped opening as quickly, and all the friends who once rushed to her galas began responding with polite regrets. And me? I didn't take the company back. I didn't reclaim my title or request a seat on the board. I didn't want it anymore. Not because I couldn't win it, because I finally understood what it cost to hold on to a legacy someone else had already poisoned. So I left. 3 months later, I moved north. Not far, just far enough to breathe again. I started my own firm, quiet, clean. No family name attached to it. Just numbers. Just work. I hired 2 analysts and a secretary who didn't care who I used to be. I drank my coffee in peace. I returned calls when I felt like it. I built something from the ground up, not to prove anything, but because it felt good to start over without blood on the floor. And then one morning, months later, I got a letter, handwritten, from Eleanor. He loved you, you know. He just didn't know how to show it anymore. I didn't take everything. You let him go long before I arrived. No apology, no admission, just a final word from someone who still thought control was the same as truth. I burned the letter in the sink, and I sat down at my desk. There's no peace in revenge, no relief. It doesn't fix what was broken, but it does something quieter, something sharper. It closes a door, permanently. And once it shuts, you finally hear what's been waiting beneath all that noise. Silence. The kind that doesn't ache anymore. The kind that tells you it's over. And that's enough.